from the University of Austin. His research uses computational methods to model how the brain processes language and represents meaning. He's also interested in fMRI technology and data visualization. Today, he will be talking about encoding and decoding language representations in Cortex. Welcome, Professor Alex Huth.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, Yifan, and thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here virtually and talking to all of you. So I guess questions from the audience, we're going to hold to the end, but if anyone online has a question you want to drop in the chat, I will try to get back to you or try to address it when I can. All right, so my name's Alex Huth. I'm an assistant professor of computer science and neuroscience at UT Austin. And yeah, I'm going to tell you today about some of the work that's going on in my lab on studying how our brains process and represent the meaning of language using computational models. All right, so the basic question that my lab is focused on, it's a very big question. It's the kind of question that we're not going to solve probably in my lifetime in any kind of satisfying way, but you gotta have goals, right? It's how do we understand language? What's happening right now is I'm saying some words. I have an idea inside my head, and I'm turning that idea into a string of words, and I'm turning those words into sounds. If you're listening to me, you are hearing those sounds. You're turning them back into words inside your head, and then you're turning those words back into an idea. All right, so I'm kind of transmitting an idea from my head to your head via language. So this is the process that I think is fabulously fascinating, and that I want to understand how this works. How do we represent ideas? How do we take words and turn them into an idea? What are the kind of formats of ideas in our brains? These are the types of questions that we're really interested in here. So the method that we use to study this is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, where we scan people's brains while they listen to language, while they do this process of taking in words and turning them into ideas in their heads. So I'm going to be showing you some images of brains through this talk, and I want to sort of orient you to the part of the brain that we're talking about, the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and sort of how we visualize this, because it's a little bit different than maybe some of you are familiar with. So this is a nice anatomical image of one subject's brain. So this is a sort of high resolution image that takes 5 minutes to take one snapshot. This is just one slice through it. And what you can see here is the sort of gray outer surface of the brain here, this curvy, crinkled thing. This is the cortex. It's a thin sheet of neural tissue where more or less all of the interesting stuff in the brain happens. That might make some people mad, but I'll stick to it. So it's where a lot of the computation that sort of makes us human takes place. So of course, since it's kind of a thin sheet, it's kind of weird to look at it in 3D. So what we do is we actually turn it into this nice 3D model so that we can look at it more nicely. So we can extract the cortical surface, we can inflate it out so that we can see down in these crinkles. We can make these relaxation cuts into the surface, and then we can flatten the whole cortex out so that we can see the surface of both hemispheres of the cortex all at once in one fell swoop, in one view. So that's what I'm showing here. We call this a cortical flat map. This is the left hemisphere. This is the right hemisphere. In the middle here is the back of the brain, and on the far left and far right are the front of the brain. Here's the visual cortex is in the back of the brain. The auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe right here, kind of on the bottom middle of each hemisphere. The motor cortex is sort of in the top middle of each hemisphere. And then everything that's out here in the very front, this is prefrontal cortex. That's the maybe weirder part of the brain that we don't know as much about what it does. Okay, so a lot of what we're going to be doing here is sort of asking questions about which parts of the brain are engaged in processing language, in representing the meaning of language. And interestingly, it turns out that language involves a ton of the brain, like a lot of the brain. A large fraction of actually your cortex is involved in processing some kind of language. even outside of just what you would think of as traditional language areas. So I'll show you that in a moment. But okay, let's talk about the type of experiment that we do in my lab that I really started doing while I was a graduate student at Berkeley a little more than 10 years ago. We do what we call a natural language experiment. So this is an experiment where we don't have any kind of fancy manipulation of the stimuli. We don't even really come up with a hypothesis before we do the experiment, which seems crazy and backwards. But we just have people lay inside an MRI scanner and then listen to stories while we record how their brains sort of represent the information from these stories. That's it. That's more or less it. So in the data set that I'm going to show you today, some results from today, we had 8 subjects who listened to up to 101 stories in the scanner. Each story is like 10 to 15 minutes long. Most of them, I don't remember the exact number, but probably around about 50 or 60 are taken from the Moth Radio Hour, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a storytelling theater and radio show on public radio. We have a bunch of other types of stories here too, so people listen to different kinds of podcasts essentially while on the scanner. This is far and away the most pleasant experiment that I've ever been a subject in. I've spent a lot of time in MRI scanners doing a lot of extremely boring things, and this is legitimately like not boring because they're fun stories. It's like it's good stuff that you would maybe consider listening to anyway in your everyday life. But here you just do it while you're in an MRI scanner, coincidentally. So one thing to know here is that this is a huge amount of data per subject. So for, I guess, only 3 of the subjects, we have this much data, but for 3 subjects, we actually have about 22 hours of data of them laying in the scanner and listening to stories. This is a very different kind of approach than a lot of cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience takes, where they often want to get data from many, many subjects, right? So they go for like large N studies where you scan 100 people or, I don't know, 200 people, 50 people, some like big number of people, but with not very many stimuli for like, each person is scanned for half an hour or less than an hour. But here we're going kind of the other way, where we have very few people that were scanned for a very long time so that we can build these incredibly detailed, intricate models of how these specific people's brains are processing and representing language. I'm happy to discuss those trade-offs. I think they're really fascinating. If anybody has a question about that, please ask at the end. And this is just a sort of an MRI detail. We, while the people are listening to stories, we use this, functional MRI to measure the bold signal, which is related to brain activity, how active each little piece of cortex is. We get one snapshot of the signal every 2 seconds. And it's divided up into these little 3-dimensional pixels that are called voxels. Each voxel is 2.6 millimeters on a side. So this is kind of the basic setup, right? So we have just data that we record while people are listening to stories. Now, like I said, this is a bit of a weird setup for an experiment because there's no hypothesis here, right? We've created an experiment where it's just data and there's no hypothesis built into the experimental design. So there's no kind of simple statistical analysis that we can do here. There's no t-test. There's no, ANOVA that we can run that will give us just like an answer of some effect. We have to figure out actually how to model this data. And the way that we do this is using this technique that was really developed over many years in Jack Gallant's lab at UC Berkeley. We call it voxel-wise modeling, and it works kind of like this. So the game that we kind of want to play is we want to find some way that we can take the words in the story, take maybe the sounds in the story, take something about the stories that the subjects are hearing, and use that to predict how the brain is going to respond to that story. All right, so what we're actually doing is we're building a separate model for each little voxel, for each of these 2.6 by 2.6 by 2.6 millimeter cubes of brain tissue. We're building a separate model that tries to predict how that little cube is going to respond to some story based on things that are happening in that story. Maybe based on the sounds that are present, so it's like the phonemes that are in the sounds, maybe based on which words are present and what those words mean, or based on more complex things. So the way that we can kind of think about this is we have the human responses. This is some response time course, this R of t. that was caused by the words of this story, right? So the words went into the human brain, and then we get the responses out. We can also take these words and we can put them into some model, some computational model that gives us features, that gives us quantitative, mathematical representations of maybe each of those words. And then we build these more or less just regression models. This is a linear regression model where we're trying to predict the response in the brain as some linear combination of features that we extract from the words, that we extract from the story. So if we get the X's here are the features from the story, then what's left over here is these weights, the betas that are, we have to estimate those. We have to use a lot of the data that we collect to figure out what the betas should be for each little brain area, which is like saying which features in this space does this part of the brain respond to. And then we can also test these models, right? So we hold out some data, we reserve some data. There's a couple stories that the subjects listen to that we don't use to train the models, that we can then predict responses on those stories, right? Because we know what the words are and we know, the model that we fit. And then we can measure the correlation between our predicted responses and the actual responses. And that gives us a measure, a very nice in a lot of ways, kind of gold standard measure of how well we're actually doing at, in some ways, computationally understanding what this little piece of brain tissue is doing, at least in natural language. Okay, so this is our basic setup. And then kind of a lot of the science that we do is in exchanging the types of features that we use. So we can try different types of features to build these models, and some types of features will work better and some types of features will work worse. So I'm going to show you very quickly one example of this. I'm not going to go through it in detail because this is now quite old. This is from some work that was published while I was at Berkeley back in 2016. Where we used this kind of approach where we had some features that represented really the kind of topic or meaning of each word. And then we built these models using those features. And then we could use that to map out which types of words each different part of the brain responded to most or was most selective for. So that's what I'm showing here. This is 3 different people's brains. On the top, there's the 3D versions. And on the bottom here, I'm just showing the flattened left hemisphere image of each of these people's brains. And the different colors here correspond to selectivity for different types of words, for words from different categories, right? So you can see in this color map on the top right, for example, red corresponds to selectivity for social words. So that's words that have to do with people, words that have to do with relationships. That ends up being kind of one of the most important categories of words to our brains. Surprise, surprise. Whereas the green and blue colors kind of correspond to selectivity for really concrete things. So what things look like visually, the kind of tactile properties of objects, maybe what it feels like to hold something. So words like rough or thick or I don't know, smooth, or the kind of tactile words. And so you can see that there are different parts of cortex that are really engaged in responding to or representing information about these different types of words. Okay, so this was work that we had now, I guess, back 6 years ago. But again, one of the really cool advantages of this type of experiment, where we don't have a hypothesis embedded in the experimental design itself, but we sort of come up with computational hypotheses after the fact, and then we build models using those computational hypotheses, is that with one experiment, we can do many different things. We can ask many different scientific questions. We can do many different studies, essentially. So in my lab, we're doing many things, sort of using data from the same experiment. I'm not going to talk about most of these things. One thing that y'all might be interested in. So one of my research assistants in my lab here, Amanda LaBelle, is now a grad student in the neuroscience program at Berkeley. And we had a paper come out just last year where we looked at, use these same kind of techniques to actually look at language representation in the cerebellum, which was a neat and interesting story. But okay, so the 2 things that I'm going to talk to you about today from the set are this work done by my grad student, Shaylee Jain, which is sort of going further than the word selectivity that I just showed and asking more broadly, can we look at which phrases each part of the brain are selective for. And then second, I'm going to talk to you about this work by my grad student, Jerry Tang, that asks, can we actually, all these models that I've told you about so far are about predicting the brain response from the stimuli, but can we also go the other way around? Can we take the brain response and use that to predict, figure out what the words were? Can we read out, can we decode from the brain what words somebody was hearing? So I'm going to tell you about that second. Okay, let's jump into the first thing here. So one of the things about these sort of earlier models, like the very colorful maps that I showed you a minute ago, is they use these features of each word. So they kind of used information about each word, about like what this word means, or like what topics this word has to do with. So that works really well, or it works kind of surprisingly well, maybe. But we also know that that's not how we understand language, right? It's like we don't process each word independently. Words come together in a specific order because that's how we construct sort of interesting ideas, right? If you said a sentence all out of order with the words in sort of random ordering, it would be, you might get the gist of what it's about, but that's not the way that we communicate, right? So another way to put this is we know that sort of word meaning, and especially language meaning, depends on context and on sort of phrase structure. So how can we incorporate this kind of information into these models? How can we extract quantitative, like numerical values from language that represent something about meaning at this kind of phrase level, or at a higher level than just the words? So this is what my student Shaylee Jane has been working on, and we've had a couple papers sort of in this direction already, but I'm going to be telling you about something that's a little bit newer today. So this is our big problem here, is the computational model. How do we, get numbers that represent like what a phrase means or what a sentence means? So this was a question that we just did not have an answer to, 5 years ago, but there has been this just tremendous explosion in the field of natural language processing and computer science, which many of you may have heard something about, that provides us with these really fantastic tools for doing exactly this thing. And specifically, this tool, the main sort of tool in our arsenal here, is this thing called the neural network language model. So this is a neural network model of some flavor. It oftentimes is a LSTM, long short-term memory recurrent neural network, or what's called a transformer network. That's sort of the more modern ones, and that's what we're going to be using here. And what this model does is it's just trained to predict the next word in a sentence, or the next word in a document, from the previous words. All right, so it's trying to approximate this probability distribution here. So the probability of the word at time t, given the words at times t-1, t-2, t-3, etc. The way that it does this is it looks maybe something like this, where if each vertical sort of stack here is one time point, and each horizontal row here is a different layer in the neural network. So this processes information through multiple layers. We have each word come in, and then it gets combined with information from the previous words at this layer, and then it gets passed to the next layer, combined with information from the previous words at that layer, and so on until at the end of this model, with, I don't know, typically 12, 24 layers, it spits out this prediction of what the next word is. So you may be thinking, how does this possibly help? Like what, why does this solve this problem? And it turns out that there's been this really kind of exciting flow of work that has come after these models were developed, that has shown that the things that these types of models learn, the things that neural network language models learn, the ways that they learn to extract structure and information from language, is actually very good at predicting brain activity. So there's been now a real spate of papers on this topic. I'm listing a few here. Now there's many dozens, really starting with, I think, this paper from Leila Wahebi in 2014. She was also a postdoc at Berkeley in Jack Allen's lab, not at that time, but later. And then an early paper from me and Shaylee on this topic in 2018. And there's been just sort of an explosion of this in the last few years. So how does this actually work? What we do is we actually kind of do almost like neuroscience on this neural network. So we take whatever the internal representation is inside the neural network, whatever sort of numbers it has come up with for representing this sequence of words, and we treat that as kind of a feature vector of that sequence of words. So we extract these internal representations and then use those as our numerical representation of the sequence of words. You can think of this as kind of like, each layer in this neural network is computing some function of a set of words, of a string of words, and this function is, it gives you a vector of numbers that says like what this string of words means. This is a vector that is useful for predicting the next word in a sequence. But it turns out that, in order to solve this problem, these language models, they have to learn a lot of stuff, right? They have to learn which words are related to each other semantically. They have to learn about kind of meaning of words. They have to learn about, agreement between, plural nouns and pronouns. They have to learn about parts of speech. They have to learn even about kind of pragmatic things. They learn a lot of stuff. They have to learn a lot of stuff in order to effectively predict the next word in a sequence. And we're taking advantage of all that here to extract this numerical representation that we're going to use. The specific model that we're using is this thing called GPT that's from a group at OpenAI that was published a few years ago. Okay, so we take these representations, we take these vectors out of this model, and then we use them to predict the brain responses. What I'm showing here is the prediction performance of these transformer-based models as compared to our older method, the one that was in the colorful figure that I showed earlier, which used what's called word embeddings. So in this map, this is a map of one subject's brain where the voxels that have performance that exceeds some threshold are shown in this color map here. If the voxels are well predicted or not well predicted by either model, or are predicted rather poorly, they're going to be shown in black. If they're well predicted by both models, sort of equally, they're going to be shown in this kind of white-pink color. If they're much better predicted by the old embedding model, the one that was in the 2016 paper, they'll show up as blue. And if they're much better predicted by this new sort of context model, they'll show up as red. And what you might notice is that there's essentially zero blue here. This new model, these new kinds of models that we have, these language model-based things that take into account word context, that take into account phrase structure, they just work wildly better at predicting brain activity. They're head and shoulders, just a massive improvement on our older methods for predicting these brain responses. And notice here, like, which parts of the brain are responding kind of consistently to stuff in the language. Sure, we get the auditory cortex here. That's predicted quite well. We get, Broca's area and another language area right here in frontal cortex. But there's also just a ton of other stuff, right? There's a huge amount of parietal cortex is actually very well predicted by these models. Inferior temporal cortex, anterior temporal cortex, and really broadly across a lot of prefrontal cortex as well. It seems like a huge amount of prefrontal cortex is engaged in doing something here. It's engaged in representing something about what this language means. But what is it? Like, what are these areas actually responding to? What do they actually care about? What information is actually being represented in each of these voxels? So that's the next question that we attacked here. Once we had these models that work very well, we can ask, what does that tell us about the brain? So with our old models, this was kind of a simple question to answer, because we could just look at, what were the words that had the highest score for each voxel. But here we don't really have that luxury, unfortunately, because it's not looking at single words, it's looking at phrases. So we have to actually do something slightly different. What we did looks like this. So I say we, this was really Shaley. Shaley built this big library of about 140,000 phrases. So these are just 10-word strings that we extracted from a bunch of stories. We take the encoding model that we fit for one voxel. So this is just like the function that we estimated for one voxel of how it responds to language. We push all these Shaley pushes all these 140,000 phrases through this model and gets the predicted response to each phrase. And then she sorted the phrases according to this predicted response. So this is showing the distribution of predicted responses across these 140,000 phrases for just one specific voxel. This is voxel 17,463 in one subject. And what you can see here is that, for most of the phrases, the response is maybe kind of Gaussian distributed around 0, but there's this very sharp tail where there's some small set of phrases that this voxel really seems to respond strongly to. That really has a strong positive response to. So what we can do next is we can look at those phrases. We can ask, like, what are these phrases that we think this model is going to respond the most to? So let me show you some examples of this and how it kind of compares to our old interpretations based on the best words. So yeah, I'm just going to show you one example of one voxel here, which was I think a very surprising one that we didn't come up with a priori as like, this is something we expect, there's going to be some part of the brain that really cares about specifically. So this is a voxel in medial frontal cortex. This is showing the prediction performance using our new contextual transformer models versus the old embedding models. So on the right here, we're showing like what were the best words for that voxel. What were the words that when they appeared in the story seemed the most likely to cause this voxel to become active? There were words like charming, gentleman, pleased, smiled, friendly, and kindness, which seem kind of coherent in some way. But when we look at the best phrases for this voxel, I think we see a much more sort of rich, detailed, and specific picture of what this voxel is responding to. And what that is specifically is examples of people being polite. This is like a politeness voxel. Never would have expected this. So here's some examples. Motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked me. Started to ask the lady a question. She said, "Excuse me." And she comes out and she says, "Look, I'm really sorry. You should probably go check in there." So I say, "Thanks." And notice that the last word is highlighted here because that's sort of how we index these phrases. Like we're looking for the response at this word, at the time of this last word, and how that relates to the sort of previous phrase. So for all of these phrases, for all these top 4 examples here, these are really just somebody doing something polite, somebody saying something polite, and maybe something polite to the narrator of the story. Again, this is not something that we would have expected a priori at all, and that's one of the cool things about doing these kinds of data-driven analyses is that we find things like this that are kind of wild and surprising. Okay, so next, we can say which phrases this voxel cares about, but that's only part of the kind of answer to the questions that we care about of like, how does the brain understand language? We can go further here using this model, and we can ask this more detailed question of how important is each word in a phrase to a voxel? All right, so going into just one of these phrases, we can ask like which words are actually important to what this voxel is doing, to what we think this voxel is doing. So the way that Shelley came up with to do this is something we call an ablation analysis. So let's look at one of these phrases. The top phrase in that last slide was motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked me. Now what we can do is we can generate a set of sort of alternate versions of this phrase where we've removed one of the words at a time, right? So motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked, motioned for me to sit next to him and me, motioned for me to sit next to him, thanked me, etc. Now, for each of these ablated phrases, for each of these phrases that's missing one of the words, we can predict the response to that phrase. So we have the predicted response to the ablated phrase, and of course we have the predicted response to the original intact phrase, and we use that to compute what we call an ablation sensitivity. So this is computed as the response to the intact phrase minus the response to the ablated phrase divided by the response to the intact phrase. Right? So if removing that word had 0 effect, if it doesn't do anything to this, then this is the response to the ablated phrase is going to be the same as the response to the intact phrase. So ablation sensitivity is going to be 0. If removing a single word, say, drops the predicted response to 0, then this is going to be R intact minus 0 divided by R intact. So the ablation sensitivity is going to be 100%, right? Because 100% of the sort of response was due to that single word. So let's look at an example of this for, again, the same voxel. So here's for this phrase, motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked me. This is showing the ablation sensitivity for each word in this phrase. And what you can see is clearly the important words here. It doesn't care about, for or to that came before. It really doesn't care much about these earlier words. It only cares about these last two, the thanked me. Like that's what matters here. And that really fits, I think, with our interpretation of this voxel, that it cares about these sort of politeness phrases, right? Okay, so what you see here in this one voxel is, it seems to care just about these last two words. Maybe some voxels only care about one word. Maybe some voxels care about, very specifically long phrases. So one question we can use this kind of setup to ask is, how many words does each brain area integrate over? How many words is it sort of combining information over to compute its response, or to, do whatever it's doing? So to get at this, what Shaylee did was she created these average ablation curves. So for each voxel, she computed, across the, say, 1,000 top phrases for that voxel, what's the average ablation curve? So just average together these sort of ablation values across all those phrases. And this tells us, on average, how much does this voxel care about words that, are in the past versus the very recent words. And then we looked for patterns in these ablation curves. We did that using a technique called principal components analysis. I'm not going to go into super detail here, but what I'm going to tell you is kind of the patterns that came out of this. So the first principal component, which is along the sort of horizontal axis here, was really just telling us, how sensitive was this voxel to any ablation, right? So voxels that had high values here tended to be just more sensitive on average to the removal of any word, and voxels that have very low values here were very insensitive to the removal of almost any word. So whatever, we can talk about the details of this if y'all have questions. The second principal component, which is along the vertical axis here, is differentiating between voxels that really only cared about one word. So only cared about like the very last word in a sequence. So, if a voxel just cares every time you hear the word table, it doesn't matter what words came before table, just whenever table appears, that voxel will be like, hey, there's the word table. That's the ones that are maybe up here on top. Whereas the voxels that are down here on the bottom are ones that have higher sensitivity to multiple words, right? So care more about multiple words at a time. So Shelley created this color map, so we can sort of assign each voxel a color based on where it lives inside the space. So these white purple voxels are ones that have high sensitivity to multiple words, whereas these kind of green black voxels are ones that maybe only care about a single word or don't care that much about removal of any single word. And then we can map this across the brain to see sort of how the brain is organized in terms of this integration behavior. So what we see here is something that's, I think, pretty interesting. Near the auditory cortex and near Broca's area, in these kind of, maybe you can think of them as slightly lower level language processing areas that are sort of doing the initial stages of language processing, we see more short-term sensitivity. So sensitivity to only maybe a single word, or not very much sensitivity to ablation at all. That's these kind of green-black voxels. Whereas in sort of superior prefrontal cortex, in the temporoparietal junction in the angular gyrus here, and especially in the right hemisphere versions of these things, we see much more selectivity for long phrases. We see voxels that are picking up on something very specific in terms of like, they want these exact words in this order, and if you remove any word, then it's going to say that voxel doesn't respond anymore. That's what's happening in these white and purple areas here. So now this is kind of a different picture. It's a different kind of measure than the semantic selectivity, the category selectivity that I showed you in those colorful maps earlier. So one of the real questions we're interested in here, and I don't have a conclusion to this story, but this is sort of what's coming next, is how these things are related, right? How the organization for timescale, or this integration across multiple words, is related to semantic selectivity. So just to recap this section on context models, using these language model features that sort of incorporate information about multiple words works extremely well at predicting fMRI data, and it gives us this really like excitingly clear picture of language selectivity in these different brain areas. And then we use this ablation analysis to find these word integration patterns. And what we're doing next is comparing that to semantic selectivity. And again, this is all work done by my fabulous grad student, Shaylee Jane. Okay, so this was kind of part one on the context. I'm going to go on to the next part now, which really uses these tools. And I kind of forget when I started, but hopefully I'm not doing too poorly on time. All right, so I've shown you that we can use these models to predict how the brain responds to language. In fact, we have extremely effective models at predicting how the brain responds to language. So presumably we should be able to reverse this. We should be able to maybe decode what the language was from the brain response. You can kind of phrase the problem this way. Given fMRI responses, can we decode the words the subject heard? Right. So this is just a reverse of our encoding model. So originally we have these stimuli, the words, they go into the brain, they give us some fMRI data out. We have the encoding model that predicts the fMRI data from the natural stimuli. And here we want to build a decoding model that predicts the natural stimuli from the fMRI data. And now this, what I'm talking about, is work by my grad student, Jerry Tang. Okay, so one way that you might think to do this, maybe the most basic way you might think to do this, is just to directly build a model that predicts the stimulus, let's call that S, from the responses R. In probabilistic Bayesian terms, you might call this P of S given R. We want to find the probability of distribution of the stimulus given the responses. There's a problem, which is that building this model directly is actually extremely difficult. It's difficult in some very weird ways. So remember I said at the beginning here that we get one image of the brain every 2 seconds, roughly. In these naturally spoken stories, we have maybe like 3 to 4 words a second. So 6 to 8 words per each brain image. And it's actually even worse than that. So the way that the bold response works, the thing that we actually measure with fMRI, we don't see just like a snapshot of neural activity. What we're actually measuring is this blood-related signal, blood oxygenation-related signal that takes like many seconds to peak and many seconds to fall. So actually, each brain image that we record it's kind of intermixed information about maybe 40 words that happened before that brain image. So actually just building this model directly that goes from the response to the stimulus is really hard for that reason. Like there's many different ways that you could arrange 40 words to make up one of these things. But it turns out there's a very nice solution to this, which was, I think, really developed by a colleague of mine, Shinji Nishimoto, when he was a postdoc at UC Berkeley, that is called Bayesian decoding. And it works like this. So, Bayes rule, you have the P of S given R, we can take this thing and we can invert it. So we can say that P of S given R is proportional to P of R given S, the probability of observing some response given the stimulus, times P of S. This is just the probability of that word sequence appearing in general. This would also be like divided by P of R, but that doesn't matter for our purposes because R is fixed. And the neat thing here is that P of R given S and P of S are all things that we already have, right? P of R given S, this is just the encoding model. This is just, can we predict the response from the stimulus? And P of S, this is the language model. This is the model that Shaylee was using to extract the features for our encoding models. So this is a model that just like says, is this a word sequence that we expect to see in English or is it not? That's what a language model can tell us. So essentially what we have here with this Bayesian decoding technique is that we can multiply together kind of our encoding model and a language model to get out decoding, to tell us like which stimuli are actually likely to have caused this brain response. One way that you can think of this is kind of that like we can guess different word sequences. The encoding model tells us whether that word sequence might have caused the brain activity we see. And the language model tells us whether that word sequence is good English, is like, sensible English. And if it's both of those things, then we say like, yes, this is the thing that we wanted to decode. So this is kind of a detail of how we do this. I'm just going to skip this. This is not actually super important, but the basic idea is this thing that I just said. We guess word sequences we evaluate using the encoding model, how likely was that word sequence to cause the brain data, and we evaluate using the language model, how likely is that word sequence in general. Let me show you some examples. Okay, so we fit this model on a bunch of data from some subject. We take some new data from that subject, from them listening to a story that is separate from the data that we trained the model on. There's a nice split here. There's division. We're not cheating in that way at all. And then we decode the words that the person was hearing. And that looks kind of like this. Okay, so the actual stimulus the person heard here was, I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. Instead, I said, leave me alone. I don't need your help. What we decoded from this was, started to scream and cry. Then she just said, I told you to leave me alone. You can't hurt me. Okay, so obviously there's some missing information. So the runaway is just gone here. The I don't need your help is not present at all. And the model confabulated something too. The you can't hurt me. That's brand new. That was not actually in the original text. It sometimes gets the sort of agent or the pronouns wrong. So interestingly, one of the things that this model seems to really struggle with is sort of who is doing what. So here, the I said becomes she said, or she just said. You'll see examples of this again. But really kind of shockingly, it gets the overall gist, but it also gets even some exact word and phrase matches, right? So scream and cry, leave me alone, leave me alone. It actually gets some of these things very precisely, which honestly is something that I'm not sure we really expected would happen with fMRI data, that this should work so well. Here's a second example. So again, this is just a little snippet of one story that the subject heard. The actual stimulus was, I don't have my driver's license yet, and I just jumped out right when I needed to. And she says, well, why don't you come back? It's like, why don't you come back to my place? Or why don't you come back home with me? And the decoded stimulus was, she has not even started to learn to drive yet. I had to push her out of the car. I said, we will take her home. So again, there's some sort of approximate matching here. Obviously, it's getting like who did what wrong again, right? She has not learned to drive yet. I don't have my driver's license yet. I had to push her out of the car. I jumped out of the car. But it's really getting, the gist of this quite well. So I don't have my driver's license yet. Has not even started to learn to drive yet. That's like a weird kind of rephrasing of the same idea. I just jumped out right when I needed to. I had to push her out of the car. So it's like, again, who is doing what is messed up, but the idea of like being pushed out of the car is, or getting out of a moving car is kind of the preserved thing here. There are, of course, these, exact matches again. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting here, so implicit in the actual stimulus here, this, I just jumped out right when I needed to, she's talking about jumping out of a car. That's what is being referred to here. That's something that happened at the very beginning of this story, and the snippet that we're looking at here is sort of toward the middle of the story. In our decoded version, it actually guesses that it was from a car, even though that wasn't in the original text, right? So I had to push her out of the car. It's getting the person wrong, but it's out of the car, right? Which is sort of expanding just this out here. So it can even maybe infer something that sort of the subject understood to be there, but wasn't said explicitly, which is fascinating. Okay, so I've shown you some of these like sort of qualitative examples, and big story on the qualitative side is that the decoder, it often captures the gist of the original stimulus, but doesn't get each individual word correctly, right? In fact, if you counted just how many words were exactly the same, it doesn't do very well at all. So we've looked at this quantitatively as well. So the word error rate, which is a standard metric of how well often like machine translation models work, or these other sort of decoding models, it's actually higher than 90%, which is whatever. I don't get into that detail. Despite the fact that the word error rate is so high, the quantitative performance, it's still like very significantly greater than chance. So this is, we looked at a few different metrics here. This is word error rate, and this is standard deviations away from a chance distribution. So for these three subjects, we're about 10 standard deviations away from chance for word error rate. For this last metric here, these blue and meteor are both like machine translation metrics that also rely on sort of which words are exactly matched. This last metric called BERT score is a newer metric that's supposed to kind of capture how well the gist is matched. Like, are these two pieces of text saying the same thing, even though they're not using the exact same words? And notice that we're doing even much better on that metric, up to like 20 standard deviations away from the chance level. So for these sort of meaning-oriented metrics, our quantitative result is much better. Okay, so I've shown you that we can do this when somebody's listening to a story. You might wonder, can we also do it while someone's just imagining speech, while someone's just imagining language? So we tested this. We had subjects memorize little 1-minute segments from different stories, and then go into the scanner and just tell those segments in their heads. So we cued them, and then they sat there and tried to think through this 1-minute story while we just recorded their brain activity, and then we tried to decode that into words. Here's some examples. So here's the imagined story. This is a little snippet from the imagined story. We had the subjects also recite the stories outside the scanner, which is what we know, sort of what the words they were saying. Look for a message from my wife saying that she has changed her mind and that she was coming back. And the decoded version is, to see her for some reason, I thought maybe she would come home to me, say she misses me. Not home, just come to me. So again, kind of gist, maybe a little bit looser. Coming down a hill at me on a skateboard, and he was going really fast. He just stopped just in time. And the decoded version is, he couldn't get to me fast enough. He drove straight up into my lane and tried to ram me. So not quite the right thing at the end, but broadly right. And this last example went on a dirt road through a field of wheat and over a stream and by some log buildings. And the decoded version was, he had to walk across a bridge to the other side and a very large building in the distance. So again, not exactly the same thing, but clearly getting the gist of what's happening here. So quantitatively, this is worse. This is definitely worse than the listening, but it's not 0. All right, I have a little time left. I have, I think, 2 more things to show you that are exciting versions of this decoding. So one question we asked then, so we can decode meaning, we can decode words from brain responses while somebody is listening to a story and imagining a story. Can we also decode it while somebody is just watching a movie that has no speech in it, that's silent? So we tried that, and I'm going to show you this example. It's it's not perfect by any stretch. It gets some weird things wrong, but it's surprising actually the things that it gets correctly. So I'm going to show here a little snippet of a movie, and then at the bottom it's going to say the words that the decoder is predicting, and I'll try to read those out as well so you can hear them. So it says, push my hand against her stomach to make her feel me there. It worked. She gasped for air. I sat on her face and pushed her into the floor. She was very weak. I held her neck to get her breathing under control. I took my first shot of her blood and put it in a cup for the nurse to clean up and bring in another one to drink to save the patient more time in the ER. So, I mean, clearly what you saw here is not like a human patient and not an ER, but it's someone tending to this wounded little baby dragon. There's blood, there's breathing, there's gasping for air. Like, it gets a lot of these things correct, which is kind of wild to us. And so, this really means that, whatever is happening in the brain when somebody watches a movie like this, and what's happening in their brain when they listen to a story, these things are intersecting. Right? We have some mingled sort of representation of meaning that's not tied to the modality of the input. Okay, so another thing we tried was, can the subject control what's being decoded by using attention? So we did this small experiment where we actually played them 2 stories at the same time. So we had one story that was told by a male speaker and one story that was told by a female speaker. We just sort of summed these up so they listened to sort of both stories at the same time. And then we asked the subjects to either attend to the male speaker or the female speaker. So just listen for what the male speaker is saying, listen for what the female speaker is saying. This is called a cocktail party paradigm. It's actually surprisingly easy to do. You can do it quite well. If you listen to it for a couple minutes, you just kind of phase out what the other story is. This is showing how similar the decoded words are to either the female story reference or the male story reference. In the condition where we ask them to attend to the female speaker, the words only, the brain decoding only captures what's going on in the female told story. And when we tell them to attend to the male speaker, the brain responses only capture, we decode only what was in the male speaker story. So yes, these subjects can definitely decode or control sort of decoding through attention. And the last thing that we looked at here that was, because in a way, all this is a little bit freaky, right? So we're getting to the point where we can actually, if we have enough data from a single subject, which again, this takes a ton of data from a single subject, we can read out in some ways like what they're thinking. I don't want to say that too specifically, but we can certainly read out words they're hearing, ideas that are in their head from a movie, a lot of stuff that's happening here. So if you're nervous about this, we also asked, like, does the subject can they resist this? Can they make it stop? Can they do something inside their heads just by thinking about it that makes us unable to decode what they're, in this case, hearing? So we tried a few different things. So we had them listen to a story, and then we did 4 different tasks. So we either had them just listen and not do anything else. We had them try to ignore the story by doing mental arithmetic, so just count back from 100 by 7s. We had them try to name as many animals as they could. And we had them try to tell a different story in their head. So do one of those imagery things that we saw before. Now this is showing, we can sort of ignore the right part of this here, but this is showing the score. So like, how well we could decode the story they were listening to when they were just listening versus counting versus naming animals versus telling a story. And what we found is that counting, it reduced, our decoding performance, but actually not significantly, whereas naming animals and telling another story, so like doing these other tasks, really kind of ruined the decoding performance. So made it go down to not quite chance, but almost chance. So yes is our answer here. The subjects can actually resist decoding. They can do something cognitively to make it so that we can't decode the story from their brains. All right, so let's wrap this up. So this decoding stuff, it works surprisingly well on language perception. It even works on this imagined speech and non-language stimuli. And it's subject to conscious control. So that's what we saw with this attention experiment and the resistance tasks that Jerry came up with extremely cleverly. I'm super excited about all this, and a lot of these things were just Jerry's idea. All right, so just to conclude here, I'm going to recap a little bit of what I talked about today. So we showed that these neural network language models like GPT are very effective at predicting these cortical responses to natural language. Honestly, we're not sure why. I gave you some justifications there, but we're not really clear on like what these models are learning. That's actually the important thing. So we're doing a lot of work on trying to answer this question in sort of more theoretical and computer sciencey ways. We showed that we can use these models to decode language from fMRI signals. And some future things are we think that we can really improve the decoding if we have better language models and encoding models. So we have models that are better able to predict the brain data, and if we have models that are sort of better models of language, these better language models, we think that'll make this just better. We also think we can make it a lot better with a closed loop decoder. So that would be where the subject can actually sort of see what's being decoded from their brain, so they can adapt to that as well as the decoder adapts to them. There's a lot of literature showing that this just works much better. And finally, one thing that we're really pushing towards here is replacing a lot of the sort of machine learning stuff that we're doing here with just an end-to-end neural network, where we just want to fit a neural network that takes in the words the person is hearing, emits the brain responses, the predicted brain responses, so we can use this neural network to model the entire language processing system. And that's a sort of very exciting end goal that we're pushing toward with some collaborators. So I just want to close by thanking the many people who are involved in this, the people in my lab, the grad students and sort of undergrad RAs and RAs who are deeply involved in the work that I showed today, especially Shaylee and Jerry, and also Amanda, who collected pretty much all this data. We have a lot of undergrads in the lab who've done work on these projects over the years. We have very close collaborators at Intel Labs, especially Vivo and Javier Turek. I didn't talk about our work with them today, but we work with them very closely. Our collaborators at UC Berkeley, especially Fatma Deniz and Kathy Chen, who we're working on some interesting bilingualism stuff with. They're in Jack Gallant's lab, and some work also with Sonia Bishop's lab. And then finally, we have some close collaborators at CMU, especially Leila Wahabi, who we're working on this end-to-end neural networks stuff with. And funding sources. That's it. But yeah, thank you all for listening. I'm very happy to take your questions for as much time as we have. I do see there's one question in the chat, which I might just answer right now.
Yeah, you can feel free to start with a question in the chat, and then we'll take question in the audience.
Okay, cool. So the question in the chat was, have these types of models been used to compare language representations or responses in people with and without language disorders, like developmental language disorders or language disorders as a result of stroke or brain trauma? That's a super interesting question. So we've tried to do this a little bit. We've tried to look at this in especially people with autism spectrum disorders. There are many groups that are trying to do this kind of thing with people who have, for example, primary progressive aphasia or stroke damage to their language network. This is a real challenge. It's a real challenge to apply our techniques because we need a lot of data from each individual subject to fit these models. And that's not really something you have the luxury of getting with subjects who are sick or unwell for other reasons, right? So it's hard to get someone who has recently had a stroke and is not having a very good time to lay in a scanner for like 10 hours and listen to stories like that. That's just not going to happen. So this is super interesting, and we really want to be able to answer that question, but right now we have a kind of disconnect between what we need to do experimentally and like what's actually possible with these kind of patient populations. So I don't have a good answer for you there, Grace. I'm sorry. Happy to take questions from the audience. There's another question.
We have a question in the audience.
Okay, maybe let's take that one first, and then I'll answer this other question in the chat.
Okay.
For the example of resistant decoding, were you able to actually decode the alternative story that the person was thinking of?
That's a great question. Sorry, I could hear that.
Okay, good.
So the question was, for the resistance, were we actually able to decode like the other thing, the thing that the subject was imagining? The answer is surprisingly no, like not at all. So we can see that like the what we decode when the person is resisting is much less similar to the story that was happening in the background, but it's also not at all similar. Like we didn't get a bunch of animal words for the condition where we had people name animals, and we didn't get a bunch of these other stories that we knew they were telling in the condition where we asked them to tell stories. So it seems like there's something happening in this resistance case where it's maybe an effortful kind of executive function or some mishmash of different representations that's going on where the person is like trying to kind of control the representation that just makes it not work. It makes it like not actually do anything reasonable at all, which is kind of the best possible thing here. Like that's what we want. We want there to be a situation where people can say like, no, I don't want this to come out of my brain. Good question.
I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. If you want to take the time to answer those, and then we'll answer a couple more in person.
Sure. Okay. So question from Elan in the chat. Does the tone of voice, like angry or sweet, affect the model in any way? So that's a fascinating question that we're just kind of trying to get into now. Currently, the answer is no. So if I can go back to this early slide. So all that our models are aware of, at least these models that I've shown you here today, is the words. So they don't sort of take the sound of the story as their input. They take a transcript. They know like when each word occurred, so maybe they can kind of tell if somebody's talking fast or talking slow. But all information about tone, intonation, roughness, are they speaking sarcastically? Obviously, that's all gone. There's nothing about that in this model. That's something that we're really interested in figuring out how to model as well. We just don't really have very good tools for it, but we are starting a collaboration with another group that we hope might have like the kind of models to answer this question. So not yet, but hopefully in the future. There's a second question in the chat here from Kayleen. do you have any hypotheses about why the decoding model struggles to discern who did what? I'm especially curious if you would still see this effect in people with a less strong theory of mind who would perhaps struggle to put themselves in another's shoes. Yeah, this is a good and like hard question. So let me go back to like one of these examples. Here. So yeah, really, again, the model, it's bad at knowing who did what. So there's one thing that's kind of a bit of a head scratcher to think about here, which is, when the stimulus says I don't have my driver's license yet, that's the narrator of the story referring to themselves, right? If the subject was presumably thinking I, that's them referring to themselves. And I really very much believe that, thinking about yourself versus others is very different, right? Like there's probably no stronger sort of distinction and representation between yourself and other people. So one thing that might be happening here, actually, because when the narrator of the story says I, this is a different person, maybe, in our subjects' heads, the narrator saying I and the narrator saying she are not that different, right? Because both I, the narrator, and she to the narrator are they're characters in this story. They're both like external to the subject, right? So that's one thing that might be responsible for this. This is very loose, though. I have no proof of that whatsoever. The question of whether theory of mind affects this, I really don't know. I think that's interesting, but looking at individual differences here again is very hard because we have very few subjects. It's even kind of not really clear whether the models, the features that we use capture I and she in a lot of detail. So that's a third thing that might be going on. Okay, there's a follow-up here. Did you see this effect in the people imagining their own story where I would definitively refer to themselves? Yeah, so in the imagery setting, I think we did see like more self-referential stuff in the imagery, but also the performance there was just worse. So we haven't actually looked at that quantitatively, but that's actually a good question. I'm going to ask Jerry to do that, to compare that here. Thanks. Sorry, I didn't hear that one.
We have some questions in person. So do you want to go?
I just wanted to ask regarding the imagined story. I was wondering, would there be some sort of a role of maybe like strength of like someone's inner monologue in how they do it? And how would you maybe measure that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Strength of internal monologue. Yeah, because it's known that some people have stronger, like more. They feel that they can perceive their own internal monologue more strongly. So I do think that this, imagining a story in the way that we did it was it was a bit different than internal monologue. So this wasn't like, somebody was just thinking through, just thinking, kind of mind wandering. This was like, they had memorized this story, they'd practiced telling it, and then we told them, you're going to do everything about telling the story except for move your mouth, right? So like tell the story, imagine you were telling the story exactly as you practiced it when we give you this cue, right? So I'm not sure it's really the same as internal monologue. That said, I think that's a really fascinating question, and like whether that would, I do know that there are people who seem to not have an internal monologue or not have as strong an internal monologue, and maybe this would be very different for them. I think the place where that might show up more strongly is actually in the movie setting, right? So here, this is not the subject actually trying to think in language at all. This is not the subject trying to imagine words specifically in the way that they are in the imagery study. This is just them watching a movie, just sitting and watching a movie. The movie's silent. They're not doing anything else. They're just like, watch this and, see what's going on, right? Pay attention to it. So here, it could be that the words that we're decoding are in some way like a part of the subject's internal monologue that they have going along with the story. Or it could be that this is, we're just reading out like some multimodal representations of like vision and language. We're kind of not sure, but that's a really interesting question too. Thank you.
Okay.
That's about time. Thank you so much, Professor. And let's give a round of applause to Professor.
You bet. Thank you all so much.